The quiet boy in seat 1A airport was alive with the usual morning chaos. Announcements echoed across the terminals. Flight numbers flickered on large digital boards, and the smell of burnt coffee drifted from every corner. Business travelers checked their watches, parents chased toddlers, and sleepy tourists pulled rolling suitcases behind them like tired shadows. In the middle of all this, an 8-year-old boy named Michael Elijah Warren stood quietly in line for first-class boarding at Gate B12 of Los Angeles International Airport, dressed in a neatly pressed blue shirt, beige khaki pants, and polished shoes that barely showed wear. Michael held a small leather backpack on his shoulder and a tablet in his hand. He was calm, respectful, and quietly focused, and not on games or cartoons, but on a page of complex mathematical equations on his screen. He wasn't just any child. He was a prodigy, a verified mathematical genius whose mind worked faster than most calculators. Michael had been invited to Boston to accept the Elijah Matthews National Excellence Award in Mathematics, the youngest recipient in history. Professors from prestigious universities had flown across the country just to meet him. He had solved problems that had stumped doctoral candidates. His photo had been in scientific journals, but none of that mattered to Michael. To him, numbers weren't about fame. They were a language, one he could understand when the world made no sense. Math was honest. Math didn't lie. It didn't judge him for the color of his skin or the size of his frame. It gave him something he could trust. His parents couldn't accompany him due to an urgent family emergency back home, but he wasn't alone in the emotional sense. Michael had been raised to be confident and careful. His father, Judge Daniel Warren, a respected federal court judge, had raised him with discipline and warmth. His mother, Nina, a surgeon at Cedars-Sinai, had taught him to be strong but gentle. Both had prepared him for this trip in great detail. His father's longtime friend, Assistant District Attorney Angela Bryant, would be waiting for him in Boston, ready to take him to the award ceremony. Everything was secure, organized, and cleared through airport authorities. Michael had flown first class before, and he had always been treated with respect. He expected nothing different this time. He didn't know that this flight would change his life forever. As Michael stepped onto the plane and turned toward seat 1A, he felt a small flutter of excitement. He loved flying. He loved watching the clouds from above, calculating altitude and speed in his mind. He slipped into the plush leather seat and placed his backpack beneath him. Pulling out his tablet, he reopened a page of advanced theoretical equations he had been working on for weeks. It was supposed to be a peaceful flight, but trouble had already taken its seat in the form of a woman 3 rows behind him. Her name was Madeline Briggs. She was in her late 40s, dressed in a fitted red blazer and black pencil skirt, with a designer handbag slung over her shoulder and an expensive perfume that filled the cabin before she even sat down. Her long blonde hair was tied in a tight bun, and her lips were painted a bright red that matched the hostility behind her eyes. To the crew, she was just another first-class passenger. To her co-workers back in Chicago, she was a regional director of communications who had been passed over for promotions twice in a row and blamed everyone but herself. Madeline had always believed she was meant for more, but she carried something inside her that was darker than just ambition, something rooted in years of bitterness, entitlement, and carefully hidden bigotry. When Madeline saw Michael in seat 1A, her face twisted into a scowl before she even realized it. To her, it wasn't just surprising, it was offensive. In her mind, first class was meant for people like her, business professionals, important travelers, people with connections, titles, and power. Not young black children traveling alone, not quiet little boys with math books and calm eyes who didn't fidget or apologize for being where they were. She didn't know who Michael was, and in her mind, she didn't need to. She had already made up her mind. That boy doesn't belong there. Michael barely noticed her at first. He was deep into his calculations, fingers moving silently across the screen. Flight attendants moved through the aisle offering water and newspapers. Passengers took their seats. And then Madeline stood up and walked toward him, her high heels clicking against the carpeted floor with a sound that cut through the soft hum of the cabin. "Excuse me," she said, towering over Michael with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I think you're in the wrong seat, sweetheart. Coach is down the other way." Michael looked up, blinking slowly as if trying to translate her words into something that made sense. He wasn't confused about where he was sitting. He wasn't lost. He hadn't made a mistake. He reached into his backpack, pulled out his boarding pass, and held it up with both hands. "Ma'am, this says 1A. This is my seat," he said gently, his voice polite and soft. Madeline didn't even glance at the ticket. She crossed her arms and scoffed. "That can't be right," she said. "Are you sure that's not someone else's ticket? Whose credit card did you use to buy this?" Michael hesitated. His parents had taught him not to share personal information with strangers, especially not financial details. But her tone was sharp, her face was getting red, and her voice was rising. Other passengers were starting to look over. "My mother bought the ticket," he replied, gripping the tablet in his lap. "And I checked in myself. I've flown first class before. It's on my name." Madeline's fake smile disappeared completely. She leaned in closer, her words more cutting now, dripping with something sour. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you don't look like someone who belongs in this part of the plane. You need to be honest right now. Did you sneak up here after boarding? Michael felt his chest tighten. He looked around, hoping anyone would intervene, but most passengers simply watched in silence. A few turned away. Only one person moved, and that was flight attendant Erica Jenkins. Erica was in her early 30s, with a calm voice and sharp eyes. She had been watching the exchange from across the cabin and stepped forward as Madeline's voice grew louder. She said firmly. May I see your boarding pass? Madeline turned to her, surprised. What? I'm in 1C. That's not the issue. This child is in someone else's seat. Erica took Michael's boarding pass and checked it against the manifest on her tablet. She nodded. This is his assigned seat. His name matches the flight record. He's checked in properly. But Madeline wasn't backing down. Her voice became louder, more theatrical. Well, then someone must have made a mistake, because this doesn't make any sense. How can a kid be traveling alone in first class? I've worked my whole life to sit up here. He probably doesn't even know how to buckle his belt. Michael felt the shame before he even knew why. The words weren't just cruel, they were unfair. He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't spoken to anyone. He hadn't touched anyone's seat or made any noise. But suddenly he was being stared at like a criminal, like a fraud. And the more she talked, the more he felt smaller, like the plane itself was shrinking around him. Please return to your seat, Erica said with a firmer tone. There is no issue here. This passenger has a valid boarding pass. Madeline hesitated, but then muttered something under her breath and turned back toward her seat. She was fuming, but for now, she sat still. She wasn't done. Not even close. Over the next 20 minutes, Madeline whispered to anyone near her, casting suspicion on Michael. She claimed to have seen him acting nervous. She pointed out how young he was, how he was traveling alone. She wondered aloud if maybe he had found someone else's ticket, or perhaps used a stolen card. And while most passengers stayed quiet, some began to murmur. A few started to look at Michael differently, not with curiosity, but with quiet suspicion. Michael tried to focus on his numbers, but the numbers blurred. His heart beat louder than his thoughts. For the first time in a long time, math couldn't protect him. And then, 30 minutes into the flight, Madeline stood up again. Excuse me, she announced, loud enough for several rows to hear. I think my phone is missing. It was right here in my bag. And now it's gone. Passengers turned their heads. Erica returned to the aisle. When did you last see it, ma'am? Before boarding. I had it when I got on the plane. And I placed it right here, Madeline said, motioning toward her seat area. She looked around dramatically. You know, it's strange. I haven't gotten up since takeoff, but someone else did. She turned and pointed toward Michael. That kid, he was walking around earlier. Remember? I saw him near my row. Michael froze. His heart dropped. He hadn't left his seat except to use the bathroom once, and that had been 10 minutes before takeoff. He had done nothing wrong. He didn't even know where her phone was. No, I didn't take anything, he said softly, his voice cracking. Maybe just check your bag, a nearby passenger said, shrugging. Sometimes kids don't realize when they pick something up. He didn't, Erica said quickly. I've been watching. He hasn't been near anyone's belongings, but Madeline insisted. Why don't we just check? If he didn't take anything, he won't mind looking. Michael's hands trembled as he unzipped his backpack, and then he saw it. A black iPhone sitting on top of his notebooks. A phone that wasn't his. A phone he hadn't touched. A phone he didn't even know existed until that moment. The silence was sudden and violent. Madeline gasped. There it is, my phone. Oh my God, I knew it. I knew something wasn't right. Michael stared at the phone, eyes wide with shock. I want to know how that got there, he whispered. Passengers started talking again, louder this time. Some looked at him with anger, others shook their heads. Erica bent down, eyes darting between Michael and the phone, confusion on her face. Please return to your seat. We'll handle this when we land, she said, trying to stay calm. No, you'll handle it now, Madeline snapped. He needs to be reported. He stole my phone. What if there's sensitive information on there? What if he's done this before? And then she said the words that changed everything. Call the police. I want him arrested the moment we land. Michael's mouth dropped open. He felt like he couldn't breathe. He looked around at the faces staring at him. They weren't kind. They weren't curious. They were judging him. He felt the tears in his eyes and wiped them quickly, not wanting them to see him cry. He had done nothing wrong. He was just a boy who loved math, a boy flying to Boston to accept an award that most adults wouldn't even understand. And now, he was being accused of theft in front of a full cabin of strangers. As the plane continued eastward, the tension thickened like a storm cloud. No one knew the truth yet. Not Michael, not Erica, not even the other passengers, but something darker had been set in motion. Something deliberate, something cruel, And what happened next would reveal just how far one woman was willing to go to destroy a child she didn't even know because of what he looked like, because of where he sat, because of what he represented. And by the time that plane landed, every person on board would have to ask themselves one terrifying question: what if we were wrong? The accusation at 30,000 feet. Hum of the engines filled the silence that followed Madeline Briggs' explosive accusation. The one-scum cabin of Flight 717 had turned into something tense and unfamiliar, like the quiet before a storm. Eyes were now on the small boy in seat 1A, the same boy who had once drawn admiration for his polite manners and quiet focus. But now, suspicion poisoned every glance. It didn't matter that Michael had been respectful the entire time. It didn't matter that he had sat there working through equations more complex than most adults could comprehend, because once a seed of doubt was planted, especially in the fertile soil of long-standing bias, it didn't take long for it to grow into something monstrous. Michael held his backpack open as if it had betrayed him. Inside, right on top of his math notes and physics drafts, was a sleek black iPhone with no case. It was not his. He didn't own a phone. His parents had agreed to wait until he turned 12. He hadn't even touched anyone's belongings during the flight. The only thing he had touched, other than his tablet, was a single packet of peanuts he hadn't even opened yet. But now, none of that mattered, because a phone had appeared in his bag, and the woman behind him was screaming that he was a thief. Erica Jenkins, the flight attendant who had been kind to Michael earlier, tried to regain control of the situation. Her voice was calm, but there was a tremor in it now. The kind that comes when you're trying to sound confident while your gut tells you something is very, very wrong. She stepped between Madeline and Michael, her posture protective, her tone gentle. Ma single quotes, please sit down. We will file an incident report and notify authorities at landing. But until then we need to remain calm. Madeline didn't sit. She had found an audience, and her ego had taken over. Her voice rose another notch, this time filled with feigned victimhood. You want me to stay calm while a thief sits in first class beside my personal belongings? Do you have any idea how much information is on that phone? I work in corporate security. There are contracts, client data, passwords. If that child accessed any of it, he didn't, Erica said, cutting in firmly. He hasn't touched anything, and you don't get to assume guilt without proof. That comment caused more heads to turn. Now some passengers were leaning out into the aisle, craning their necks to get a better view of the accused. A man in seat 2B, middle-aged with salt and pepper hair and a Bluetooth earpiece still in one ear, narrowed his eyes. I saw the kid walking back from the restroom earlier, he said, not with certainty but suggestion. He could have passed by her seat then, just saying. Someone behind him murmured in agreement. Then another passenger added, well, it's unusual, right? A kid this young flying alone in first class. And just like that, the tide began to turn. Michael sat frozen in his seat. He didn't understand why it was happening, not really. He had been raised to believe that the world was mostly fair, that being honest and respectful would protect him. He had never imagined that people would look at him and assume the worst just because he was young and black and alone. His hands gripped the edge of his tablet. His throat was dry. He tried to speak, but the words were stuck behind the lump that had formed. I didn't take anything, he finally whispered. Madeline rolled her eyes, loud enough for everyone to hear. They always say that. Always the same story. I didn't take it. It just appeared in my bag, right? Because phones fly on their own. Michael looked at Erica, pleading with his eyes, silently begging for anyone to believe him. She reached down and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. I believe you, she said softly. But she didn't say it loud enough for the others to hear. In the back of the first-class cabin, another voice joined in. It was Curtis Banks, a 50-something black businessman in a gray suit who had been quietly observing until now. His tone was even and measured, but firm. What kind of person accuses a child without knowing the full story? He asked. Madeline turned to him with a sharp look. The kind of person who cares about security and doesn't want to see criminals get away just because they're young. Curtis leaned back in his seat, disappointed but unsurprised. You didn't even look at the phone's lock screen, did you? Madeline blinked. What if it's your phone? He said. Why not unlock it right now? She hesitated for the first time. Just a flicker, but enough for those paying attention to notice. Her fingers moved toward the device, which Erica now held. The phone screen lit up, prompting for a passcode. Madeline tapped in 6 digits. The phone buzzed. Incorrect. She tried again. Incorrect. Passenger murmur turned into audible confusion. You're putting in the wrong code, someone said. Is it even your phone? Madeline flushed. It must be a glitch. I'm using my work password. Maybe this one was set up differently. Curtis raised an eyebrow. You just said the phone had sensitive work info on it. Now you don't remember the passcode. Madeline's lips thinned. She took a step back. The confidence was cracking. Erica looked at her tablet, then at Michael, then at the silent passengers watching everything unfold. I'm going to call the captain, she said, but Madeline's plan wasn't over. She pointed again. Look in his backpack. There might be more. Maybe it's not just my phone. Maybe there's other stolen property. No. Michael's voice was sharp now, almost desperate. He grabbed the bag and clutched it to his chest. "It's my stuff. Don't touch my things." His voice cracked at the end, and the tears came. Not loud sobs, but silent drops that fell onto his lap as he held his bag tighter. And just like that, the confidence of an 8-year-old genius shattered under the weight of public suspicion. Erica backed away. "We're not touching anything until the authorities get involved." Madeline smiled. "That's more like it. 30 minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a reported incident on board, we'll be making an unscheduled landing in Kansas City for investigation and passenger safety. Please remain in your seats." The entire cabin erupted into whispers. The words incident and investigation traveled fast, faster than common sense. And in the middle of it all, Michael sat alone, head bowed, while adults around him crafted stories of crime and punishment in row 5. A woman began typing out a Facebook post. "You won't believe what just happened on my flight. A kid tried to steal a phone in first class." In row 2, a man started recording with his phone, narrating softly, not knowing his video would soon go viral. Back in seat 1A, Michael wiped his tears with his sleeve and opened his tablet again. The numbers were still there. Stable, safe. They didn't lie. They didn't point fingers. They didn't ask him why he was in first class. They simply existed, clean and precise, and that's when he knew. He couldn't explain the phone in his bag, but he would explain the truth, and not with fear, not with panic, with logic, with clarity, with the only thing he trusted, dash-proof. And somewhere in the cabin, one passenger had seen more than anyone realized, but that truth hadn't arrived yet. Because justice, like math, sometimes takes its time. The flight that changed everything. The landing was rougher than usual. The wheels of the aircraft screeched against the runway of Kansas City International, the tension inside the cabin louder than the braking gears beneath them. No one cheered, no one clapped. The usual sighs of relief that accompanied safe arrivals were replaced with stiff shoulders and darting eyes. Even as the plane taxied toward a remote part of the tarmac, far from the regular gates, most of the passengers remained seated, not out of courtesy, but because the captain had instructed them firmly not to move. Flight 717 had been reclassified as a flight under investigation. That meant armed police, airport security, and a delay of uncertain length, but for Michael Warren, none of those logistical details mattered. His eyes were fixed on the floor. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. How had a phone he had never touched ended up in his backpack? How could so many adults believe he was a thief without asking a single question? He could feel the weight of their stares. They weren't loud anymore. In fact, the cabin was strangely quiet. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, like a heavy fog that hung over his small shoulders. He held his tablet like a shield, staring down at an unfinished math equation he couldn't solve anymore, not because the numbers were wrong, but because his heart wasn't in it. For the first time in his life, he didn't want to do math. He just wanted to go home. The tears had dried, but the confusion hadn't. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't spoken in almost 30 minutes. Except to whisper, "I didn't do it," when the flight attendant asked if he was okay. He wasn't. No child would be. Madeline Briggs, on the other hand, sat smug in her seat. Her arms were crossed, her chin held high. She had called a supervisor at her company mid-flight using the in-seat phone, describing how she had single-handedly uncovered a mid-air security breach involving a juvenile impersonator. She used words like theft, data risk, and corporate privacy violation. Her voice had been steady and proud, like someone reporting a victory. She made sure everyone heard her say she would press charges. When the captain's announcement mentioned law enforcement, her smile deepened. She believed she had won. To her, this wasn't about truth. It was about power. And power, when held by someone who thinks they're always right, becomes dangerous. She didn't realize her moment of triumph was built on a lie her own. The plane came to a complete stop, and within seconds, the doors opened. The jet bridge had not been connected. Instead, a set of rolling stairs had been positioned against the aircraft's main door. 4 uniformed officers stood at the bottom, flanked by airport security agents. One of them carried a black tablet, already synced with the flight manifest. Another held a body cam angle toward the cabin. They were efficient, calm, and entirely unaware that what they were about to step into was more than a simple case of suspected petty theft. It was a storm of injustice waiting to explode. As the officers boarded, the energy in the plane shifted. Some passengers sat straighter, preparing to share what they had witnessed. Others looked away, suddenly unsure of what they had believed. A few glanced at Michael with something resembling guilt, but none of them spoke. Madeline, of course, wasted no time. She stood up the moment the lead officer entered, pointing dramatically at Michael like she was presenting a criminal to a jury. "That's him," she said with confidence. "That's the boy. He took my phone, denied it, and then tried to hide it in his backpack." The officer nodded slowly but said nothing. He turned to Erica, who had remained close to Michael, and asked to see the boarding pass and passenger manifest. She handed them over wordlessly. Then the officer did something unusual. He crouched down in front of Michael, lowering himself to eye level. Michael didn't look up. The officer introduced himself. "My name's Officer Linwood. Do you know why we're here?" Michael nodded but didn't speak. His eyes were glassy. His hands trembled slightly on his tablet. "They said I took something. But I didn't," he whispered, barely audible. "I swear." Officer Linwood looked at him for a long moment, then glanced at the tablet in Michael's lap. It displayed a string of equations so advanced that even he couldn't understand them. "Are you doing math right now?" Michael blinked, then nodded. "Math keeps me calm," he said quietly. Officer Linwood straightened up and walked back to his team. He whispered something to one of them. The officers began asking for passenger statements. Madeline was the first to speak loud, rehearsed. Emotional, she described the moment she discovered her phone was missing, how she had seen Michael near her seat earlier, how she bravely asked him to check his bag. She painted a picture of a frightened woman protecting her belongings from a dishonest child. It was polished, professional. Fake. Passenger after passenger gave statements. Some swore they saw the phone fall out of Michael's bag. Others said they weren't sure, but agreed with Madeline because she seemed credible. One man even claimed he saw Michael looking suspicious before the accusation, though he admitted under questioning that he hadn't actually seen the phone being taken. And then, Curtis Banks stood up. "I saw something different," he said. "I saw a woman angry that a black child was in first class. I saw her confront him twice. I saw her get up to use the restroom before the phone went missing. And I saw her come back with a different energy. No panic, no surprise, just calculation. And then, right after she sits, suddenly her phone's missing, and it ends up in his backpack." The officers took notes. One of them asked if he had video. Curtis said no. He hadn't recorded it. He hadn't expected he'd need to. He was trying to respect privacy. Madeline rolled her eyes and accused him of bias. "Of course you're defending him," she snapped. "You people always protect your own." The words hung in the air like a slap across the face. The cabin turned to stone. Even the officer who had been scribbling notes paused, his pen suspended midair. Michael didn't understand the full meaning, but he felt the venom in her voice, and more importantly, he saw Curtis's eyes close. For a long second, his jaw tightening, not in anger, but in sadness. One of the officers spoke up sharply. "Ma, single quotes that's enough. Please return to your seat." And for the first time, Madeline's authority wavered. Her smugness dimmed slightly. She sat. Officer Linwood returned to Michael's seat. He crouched again. "We need to check your bag, son, just to be sure. Will you let us?" Michael hesitated. Then slowly, he handed over the backpack. The officers opened it carefully. The phone was still inside. Officer Linwood examined it closely. He turned it over. There were no fingerprints visible, but the surface looked too clean wiped, in fact. He powered it on. Locked. 6-digit code required. He asked Madeline to unlock it. She did, after 3 failed tries. It finally opened on the 4th. The officer tilted the screen toward his team. It had no apps, no contacts, no photos. It had been factory reset recently. "That doesn't look like a personal phone," Linwood said. "When did you say you lost this?" Madeline faltered. "I mean, I had it earlier. Maybe I forgot I reset it." One of the younger officers leaned toward his partner and whispered. Michael sat still, watching everything. The numbers on his tablet blurred, not from calculations. From something he didn't yet recognize. Hope. Just as the officers prepared to ask more questions, a new voice interrupted the tension. It came from seat for a. "Excuse me," said a woman with dark glasses and a ponytail. "I have something to show you." She stood and walked toward the officers, holding out her phone. Her name was Amira Price. No one had noticed her earlier. She had kept to herself, but now, she had everyone's attention. She turned the phone screen around and pressed play. The video was clear, high resolution, no shaking hands, no sound but the quiet ambient noise of a cabin. The frame showed Madeline standing beside Michael's seat. It was time-stamped for 1 hour earlier, and in that frame, as she bent forward and accidentally bumped into Michael's chair, you could see her right hand slipping something black into the side pocket of his bag. Slow, deliberate, undeniable. The cabin exploded into a stunned silence. The officers watched the footage again, and then again. There was no doubt, no ambiguity, no way to spin it. Madeline Briggs had planted the phone in Michael's bag. Michael turned to Amira, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Thank you," he whispered. She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I should have said something sooner." Officer Linwood stood, his face unreadable. "Madeline Briggs," he said, "please stand up. You are being detained for questioning regarding false allegations and obstruction of investigation." "What?" she shouted. "You can't be serious. He's the thief. That video is fake. You can't arrest me." But the handcuffs were already being pulled out, and the woman who had once demanded an 8-year-old be arrested now found herself standing in the wrists behind her back, mouth open in horror. Michael watched as she was led away. It wasn't joy he felt. It wasn't revenge. It was something quieter, deeper. It was relief. not just for himself but for truth. As she was taken down the stairs, the same passengers who had whispered and doubted now stared at their hands, their laps, the floor. A few turned to Michael. One or two apologized quietly, most said nothing. But the silence was different now. It was heavy with shame. Erica kneeled beside Michael. "You okay?" He nodded slowly, then added, "I just want to go to Boston, that's all." And somewhere inside the terminal a phone call was being made to a man who would soon bring the entire truth crashing down with the force of power, justice, and a father's love. But that part of the story hadn't arrived yet. Not yet. When the Father Aravet's police cruiser sat idling just outside the side hangar of Kansas City International Airport, its engine humming quietly as the early afternoon sun beat down on the silver roof. Madeline Briggs was seated in the back, her wrists cuffed tightly behind her, her eyes darting wildly across the terminal's restricted tarmac. Her lipstick was smudged, her blazer wrinkled, and her perfectly pressed hairstyle had begun to fray around the edges. Just like her confidence, the once proud executive who had strutted down the airplane aisle like she owned it now sat slumped, silent, and increasingly aware that everything in her life was about to collapse. But the true weight of her mistake hadn't even arrived yet, until a sleek black private jet touched down on runway 5C. The plane was smaller than the commercial jets parked nearby, but it moved with a kind of quiet authority. It wasn't there for show, it was there for business. Inside that jet, seated at a polished mahogany table, was Daniel Warren, federal judge, civil rights attorney, and most importantly, father of Michael Warren. The call had come barely minutes ago from Officer Linwood himself, who had looked into Michael's file after the incident. On board revealed something didn't add up. Once he realized who the boy was and what had really happened, he had picked up the phone and called the emergency contact number listed on Michael's profile. The voice that answered was calm, measured, and dangerously quiet. "I'll be there in 90 minutes. Judge Warren had said, and true to his word, he was. As the plane taxied to a halt, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to meet it. 4 men in suits stepped out, followed by one man in a dark gray overcoat who didn't run, didn't rush, but walked with a stillness that turned heads. Daniel Warren was a tall man, broad-shouldered, bald, with skin the color of dark oak and eyes that could see through you like glass. His calm was the kind that came not from silence, but from knowing you carried more truth than the room could handle. As he approached the terminal, his phone buzzed in his coat pocket. It was his wife, Nina, who had just finished surgery at Cedars-Sinai, and had only just heard what happened. "He's okay," Daniel said before she could speak. "Not hurt, just shaken. They put handcuffs on our baby," Nina whispered. "I know," Daniel replied, his voice tightening, "and they're going to regret that." Inside the airport's private security lounge, Michael sat curled on a padded bench, holding a water bottle he hadn't touched. The officers had removed the restraints long ago, apologized profusely, and offered him snacks, juice, and even a toy from the lost and found bin. But Michael didn't want any of it. He had spoken only once since being escorted from the plane. "I want my dad," that was all he said. And so they waited, while the boy stared at the wall, his brilliant mind silenced by something even logic couldn't explain. Then the door opened. There was no mistaking who had arrived. Judge Warren didn't say a word at first. He stepped into the room and saw his son sitting there, small and quiet, but whole. The officers in the room instinctively stood. They didn't need to be told who he was. They could feel it. Michael looked up and, "The damn broke dad," he said. And in the next instant he was in his father's arms, held so tightly that even the air seemed to pause. Daniel didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just held his son and closed his eyes, because there were no words for what had been done. Not yet. Officer Linwood cleared his throat. "Sir, I can't apologize enough." Daniel looked at him. "You will," he said, "but not to me, to him." Linwood nodded and knelt down in front of Michael. "I'm so sorry, Michael. I believed something that wasn't true. I should have asked more questions. I should have protected you. We all should have." Michael looked at him, his voice steady for the first time all day. "You looked at me and saw a problem, not a person," he said. "My math teacher says bias is a bad equation. It always leads to the wrong answer." Linwood lowered his head. Daniel turned to the room. "I want every name," he said. "Every passenger who made a statement. Every recording, every report. I want to know who planted the phone, and I want to see her now." The officers exchanged a look. "She's in custody, waiting in the transport car," one said. "We're preparing formal charges." "Good," Daniel replied, "because now you're going to add one more." "For what?" "Attempted character assassination of a minor with malicious intent," he said. "I'm filing a private suit in federal court, and you will testify." The officers nodded. They understood what was coming. The world finds out next morning. A new sun rose over Kansas City, casting a warm glow across the airport hangars and runways. But inside the private departure lounge, a different kind of warmth spread, one not from the sun but from quiet resolution, from healing, from a boy regaining a piece of himself after being torn down. Michael sat between his parents on a cream-colored leather sofa, freshly dressed in a navy sweater and slacks, his hands resting on his math tablet again. He wasn't smiling, not fully, but his posture had changed. The fear was gone. The confusion had faded, and in its place was something stronger. Something forged through trial and quiet pain - resilience. Judge Daniel Warren had spent the early morning on phone calls, not angry, but deliberate. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. When a federal judge calls top executives at an airline's headquarters, people answer. When that same judge provides video proof, eyewitness statements, and a documented timeline involving a minor's civil rights violation, policies don't just change, people do. Within hours, the airline issued a formal public apology. Not just a tweet, a full press statement. They acknowledged a failure in internal procedures, staff training, and passenger protection standards and committed to launching a complete investigation into racial bias and passenger safety protocols. But that was only the beginning, because what Daniel Warren did next was something no one expected. He sent the video to the press, not for vengeance, not for fame, but for accountability. Because too many stories like Michael's never reached the world. Too many children suffered in silence. Too many parents buried their rage because the system didn't believe them. But this time, the system had evidence. And once that evidence reached the public, everything changed. By noon, the video had gone viral. Millions of views within 3 hours. It wasn't just the footage of Madeline planting the phone that struck people, it was the silence of the other passengers. The expressions of suspicion. The moment Michael opened his backpack and quietly whispered, "I didn't take it." That one sentence broke the internet's heart. Influencers began sharing it. Celebrities commented. Civil rights leaders issued statements. Hashtags like #Justice for Michael, #Seat1A, and #Believe the Child trended globally. It wasn't just a story about racism, it was a story about how easily lies can destroy lives, and how even brilliance can be ignored when wrapped in brown. Skin.CNN ran a segment titled "Math Prodigy Falsely Accused America Watches in Shame." BBC called it a quiet child, a loud injustice. Even international leaders commented, with Canada's Minister of Education tweeting, "Michael Warren is the kind of genius the world needs, not the kind it should destroy with prejudice." And beneath all that noise, Michael's story began to bloom not as a scandal, but as a symbol. Within hours, the National Mathematics Consortium released an open letter of support, reaffirming Michael's recognition as the youngest inductee to the prestigious Hall of Honor. Professors at MIT, Stanford, and Caltech began offering private mentorship invitations. Even NASA issued a press statement saying they would proudly support Michael's academic journey if and when he ever wanted to work among the stars. But what moved people the most wasn't the math, or even the injustices, was Michael's dignity. A quiet, polite boy who could have screamed, but didn't, who could have lashed out, but instead asked for his father, who sat with tears on his face and still worked through equations while strangers judged him. He became something rare, a child who reminded the world what humanity could look like, even when it didn't deserve it. Meanwhile, Madeline Briggs' world collapsed in real time. She had been released on bail by noon, but found herself in the center of a digital firestorm. Within 24 hours, she lost her job, her board positions, and her speaking engagements. Her employer issued a statement denouncing her actions, and announced a complete internal review of all staff behavior related to bias and discrimination. She deleted her social media accounts, but screenshots circulated widely. Online forums compiled her quotes from the plane, pairing them with the footage of Michael sobbing. Her name trended for all the wrong reasons. She became a less just in racism, but in entitlement, arrogance, and how quickly lies unravel when the truth is documented. Civil lawsuits followed swiftly. Daniel Warren filed a federal suit on Michael's behalf, seeking damages for emotional trauma, defamation, and endangerment of a minor. Civil rights attorneys across the country signed on to support it. Psychologists provided assessments of Michael's mental health impact. While Michael didn't fully understand the legal terms, he understood one thing: people were finally listening. Still, the boy remained grounded. He didn't ask about the money. He didn't ask about fame. All he asked his parents was, "Can I still go to Boston?" And the answer, of course, was yes. On the evening of the second day, a private jet lifted off once again, this time bound for the Mathematics Hall of Honor conference in Boston. But the arrival was different than originally planned. Reporters lined the edges of the terminal. Security escorted Michael and his parents through a private entrance. Flashes clicked. Microphones were raised. But Michael said nothing to them. He just walked with his father, holding his mother's hand on one side and his tablet in the other. His focus wasn't on headlines. It was on solving the last equation he had paused before that awful moment on the flight. And then the ceremony began. Inside the grand auditorium of the Boston Science Center, hundreds of academics, students, and families filled the rows. The spotlight on stage illuminated a small podium that barely reached Michael's chin. But when he stepped forward, standing in his navy suit and boaty, silence fell like a curtain. There was no teleprompter, no prepared statement, just a small piece of paper clutched in his hand. He looked out across the crowd, then down at the note. Then he folded it and placed it in his pocket. "I was going to read something smart," he began, his voice soft but steady. "Something with big words and complicated math, to show how smart I am. But that's not what I want to say." You could hear a pin drop. When people looked at me on that plane, they didn't see a mathematician. They saw something to be afraid of. They didn't ask questions. They didn't give me a chance. They just decided I didn't belong. But my mom says you belong wherever you work hard to be. And my dad says when people don't believe you, you keep telling the truth anyway. So that's what I did, and now I'm here. The audience was breathless. Math doesn't lie. Math doesn't care what color you are. It doesn't care how old you are. It just asks you to solve it. And that's what I want to do with my life. I want to solve the problems people say can't be solved. Even the big ones. Even the ones like this. Then he paused, looked out again, and added the words that would be quoted around the world. "I forgive the people who hurt me. Not because they deserve it, but because I deserve to be free." And the room erupted. A standing ovation that lasted 4 full minutes. Professors wiped tears from their eyes. Parents hugged their children tighter. And for one beautiful moment, the world didn't just see Michael, they heard him. Later that night, as he sat in the hotel room beside his parents, flipping through his notes, Michael asked quietly, "Do you think she knows? The lady from the plane, do you think she knows she was wrong?" His father looked at him for a long moment and said, "Maybe, maybe not, but the rest of the world knows, and that matters more." Michael nodded. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need her apology. What he needed was what he had earned. His voice, his dignity, and the knowledge that truth like math eventually adds up. But the story wasn't over yet, because Michael's rise had only just begun, and the world was about to see how far one boy with numbers, courage, and grace could go. The legacy of Seat 1. 8th week that followed the mathematics conference in Boston was unlike anything Michael Warren or his parents could have imagined. What began as a terrible injustice on a quiet flight from Los Angeles had grown into a national reckoning, not just about one boy, but about the way people view young black children in public spaces. And as the world came to learn more about what happened in Seat 1A, Michael's name became more than a headline, it became a movement. By Monday morning, over 30 million people had watched the video of Madeline Briggs planting the phone in Michael's backpack. Millions more had shared posts, written essays, or commented their outrage under hashtags like #Seat1A, #MichaelWarren, and #ListenBeforeJudging. Public opinion had shifted rapidly. Journalists wrote think pieces not just about the moment itself, but about the deeper pattern behind it, the way young black boys were so often perceived as threats before they were ever seen as children. Universities across the nation issued statements of solidarity. School boards adopted new anti-bias training programs. Non-profit organizations created entire campaigns dedicated to supporting gifted children of color who often went unseen, unprotected, or disbelieved. But the most extraordinary ripple effect came from Daniel and Nina Warren themselves, who chose not to simply bask in public support, but to turn their family's pain into something permanent. Standing before a podium at a live-streamed press event outside the National Press Club in Washington, Judge Warren made the announcement that would carry Michael's name into history. "We cannot undo what was done to our son," he began, his hand resting gently on Michael's shoulder as they stood side by side. "But we can ensure that other children like Michael never feel alone, never feel invisible, and never have their brilliance overshadowed by ignorance and fear. That is why, starting today, we are proud to launch the Michael Warren Initiative." The press leaned forward, hanging on every word. "The initiative," Daniel continued, "will be a national scholarship and mentorship fund dedicated to identifying and supporting gifted minority youth in the areas of mathematics, science, and the arts. It will provide not just money for tuition and supplies, but access to mentors, protection from systemic bias, and the kind of public visibility that ensures they are never silenced again." Gasps and applause followed. Then Nina stepped up to the microphone, speaking with the quiet passion of a mother who had nearly lost her faith in people, only to find it again in her son's courage. "Every time Michael opens a book, or solves a problem, or quietly chooses dignity over anger, he teaches us," she said. "He reminds us that greatness is often soft-spoken, and that the world must listen more closely to its children." The fund, seeded by donations from their family and matching contributions from private tech donors and celebrities, began with a staggering $100 million. Within days, it crossed $150 million. Names like Viola Davis, LeBron James, Tyler Perry, and even Elon Musk added their support. It was clear this wasn't just about money, it was about legacy. But while the world celebrated Michael's resilience and the powerful response his story had triggered, he himself remained grounded. He returned home to Beverly Hills with his parents and resumed his usual routine: early morning problem sets, afternoon nature walks with his mom, and Friday movie nights with his dad. Reporters begged for interviews, and talk shows extended invites, but the family declined most of them. Michael wasn't interested in being famous. He only wanted to get back to being a kid, albeit a kid who could solve college-level equations before breakfast. One afternoon, While working through a new math theory on gravitational compression, Michael asked his dad a question that stopped him in his tracks. "Do you think all those people would have listened if I wasn't good at math?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He closed the book he was reading and looked at his son for a long moment. Then he said, "Maybe not. Maybe some only cared because of how brilliant you are. But that's why we're changing things, son. So, the next child, whether they love math or music or just drawing dinosaurs, doesn't need to prove anything to be believed." Michael nodded and went back to scribbling formulas, but the world hadn't forgotten Madeline Briggs. By now, her name had become a cautionary tale in every diversity training module across the country. After being terminated from her job and arrested for making false accusations, Madeline's legal team attempted a weak defense based on misinterpretation and concern for safety. But the video and eyewitness testimony dismantled every excuse. She eventually pled guilty to multiple misdemeanor charges, avoiding jail but receiving a hefty fine, mandatory racial bias education, and 300 hours of community service, including court-mandated speeches at juvenile justice conferences where she was required to explain how her actions had nearly destroyed a child's life. When asked in one of her final public interviews whether she felt sorry for what she had done, her answer was stiff. "I regret the outcome." That sentence alone cemented public opinion. There was no apology, no acceptance of blame, only regret for being caught. In contrast, Michael's grace throughout the ordeal became the final chapter of his story that people clung to, not because he cried, not because he suffered, but because he chose forgiveness, because he continued to solve math problems in the face of disbelief, because he smiled when others would have shouted, because in a moment where the world gave him every reason to stop trusting people, he still believed it could be better. Schools across the country began naming their math rooms after him. Seat 1A became symbolic not just as the place of his pain, but as a reminder of courage. What would Michael do? Became a question teachers posed when students faced injustice or judgment, and in time, his story was included in textbooks not as tragedy, but as transformation. 1 year later, standing once again before an audience of scholars at the National Gifted Children's Summit, now 10 years old and taller by several inches, Michael delivered the final words that would become immortal. "I used to think I had to be perfect to be safe, to be brilliant to be seen, but I've learned something better. I don't need to change to make people comfortable. They need to change to see clearly." He paused. "I still love math, but now I want to study people too, because equations are honest. And maybe, just maybe, we can teach people to be more like mythological, fair, and true." Thunderous applause followed that as he walked off the stage. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, tears shining in her eyes. His father smiled, proud, but quiet. And as the audience stood, many of them whispering his name with reverence, Michael Warren did not bask in the spotlight. He looked up at the ceiling lights and whispered to himself, "I forgive her." Because in the end, Michael wasn't just the boy in seat 1A, he was the reminder the world didn't know it needed. That greatness comes in quiet forms. That justice, when guided by love and truth, speaks loudest when it doesn't shout. And that no child should ever have to be extraordinary just to be treated as human.